Give it to you or what?
Lucy first and then...
I give it to you. I hand it to you. Okay? Yeah, I'll send us good morning again, everybody. Hello. Just before we kick off the second session here, I'd like to draw your attention to one other thing. We are running the European Journalism Center, got some funding from the Gates Foundation to support writing about development issues. And we have a grant running. We just finished the first deadline. We got around 500 applications, about 100 from Italy. There's a second deadline coming up in September. I would like to draw your attention to it. Anybody doing data journalism would be very welcome to apply. You find us on the web. It's under journalismgrants.org. We're also on Twitter. We're also on Facebook. And I have some flyers here I will put in the press room next door. So anybody who is looking for funding to write about Millennium Development Goals and topics like this is very welcome to apply, and we hope to enable around 50, 60 stories this year to be run in newspapers and outlets and on the web. So give it a thought, and if you have any more questions, come up to me, and then I'll give it to Lucy now, and then we go into the data stuff.
Move away from the speakers. Thank you very much for coming at 9:30 on a Thursday morning. This is the second round of the School of Data Journalism. We were here this time last year, and we're very happy to be invited back again. Last year, we're running, both years we've run a series of panels and workshops. So this is our second panel. Later on today at 2:00 in Hotel San Gallo, there will be our second workshop, which will be about using Twitter to do social network mapping, so using the Twitter API. And we're going to be looking at some tweets from around the festival, seeing how people are behaving using Twitter at the festival, all being well if the internet works. My name is Lisa Chambers, and I work for the Open Knowledge Foundation on a relatively new project called the School of Data. And together with the European Journalism Centre, we club together every year to do these. We hope they'll keep inviting us. All of the materials from these sessions are going to be posted both on schoolofdata.org and datadrivenjournalism.net after the session. Can we bring up the slides? And a couple of logistical announcements. We've got a hashtag for the event if you're following this remotely, which is #DDJSchool. I think that's everything that I need to say for this.
Good morning, everyone. I am Liliana Bounegru. I am leading data journalism activities at the European Journalism Center, and I will be chairing this session this morning. In this session, we are going to talk about investigative journalism, and we have with us today 4 award-winning investigative journalists and programmer journalists behind some of the most successful platforms and networks around investigative journalism. And from left to right, we have with us Paul Radu, the Executive Director of the Organised Crime and Corruption Project. We have James Ball, who is an investigative journalist at The Guardian and also associated with the platform Help Me Investigate. We have Jack Thurston, who is founder of farmsubsidy.org and fishsubsidy.org, two of the major investigative projects into EU public spending. And our hacker for the day is Friedrich Lindenberg, who is Open News Fellow at Spiegel Online and formerly worked on the OpenSpending platform at the Open Knowledge Foundation. So in this session, the speakers that we have today are all associated with great investigative projects and are running great stories. But what we want to focus on today is the infrastructure the networks of people and the platforms of data and resources that support this investigative work. So we will discuss about how to stimulate successful collaborations around investigations, how to fund and sustain this work. So we will start by giving each of the panelists 10 minutes to introduce themselves and give a short talk, and then we will move into discussions and take questions from the audience. So who would like to start? Maybe we can start with Paul?
I'll have to connect my laptop.
All right, so then we can start with Friedrich then.
Okay. Fantastic. Good morning. Let me just... Okay, so as Jana already pointed out, I'm one of two people here on this panel this morning who wouldn't call their primary job titles, I think, journalists. You would also probably define yourself as a kind of policy expert rather than a journalist, right? But for me, it's quite serious. I'm not a journalist. What I am is basically I'm an open data kind of civic coder. What I'm interested in is working with public data, working with data that's been released and produced by governments, and trying to make sense of that and trying to explain that to people, and trying to use that to also create a better kind of discourse around policies, around what's happening in a particular country or in a particular region. And the reason I find this session here very exciting is because I think there's still a big rift between these two communities. The kind of open data civic development community on the one hand, which is mostly technologically driven, it's driven by the interest in using tech for good. And on the other hand, the journalism community, where you have people who are really interested in telling good stories and investigating stuff, but come from a very non-technical point of view, where a lot of what they do is about investigating people, not so much. People are not so much used to looking at data as a valid source of what's happening in the world. And I think that's changing, but in most of the world, outside of a few kind of temples of this kind of merger, it's still true that this doesn't happen every day, right? And we're working very differently. So I think for the OpenGov folks, what we're mostly interested in is monitoring governments, monitoring power. So we look at kind of sustained structures. We build these ongoing platforms where data gets collected, data gets cleaned up or worked on in some way, and then it gets presented to users. Whereas for a journalist, there always needs to be some kind of scoop. There always needs to be an end when the article goes up on the homepage, and this is what you're trying to tell, right? And so these are very different modes of working together again. I want to tell you a bit about OpenSpending. OpenSpending is a project that I think was created more than 2 years ago now. It came out of a project in the UK called Where Does My Money Go? Where Does My Money Go tried to kind of show the budget of the UK. And what we realized is that the work that had been done for the UK was basically repeatable, right? There was people in countries all over the world trying to do the same kind of high-level overview of government finance, and we recognized that it would be very stupid for people to just go and rebuild the same thing in 190 countries, because really there's a lot you can share, right? So just to show you a few examples, this is the OpenSpending homepage, and we run a lot of information on that. But to show you some things, this, for example, is a website from Moldova called Budget Stories, where basically they're using technology that's been developed in OpenSpending to show how the government in Moldova would spend its money and how funds are being distributed. And the same thing can be applied to a very different country. For example, this is Cameroon, where it's kind of hard to get information about what the government does. But there is the investment budget that has been published in a lot of PDF files, and again we took that and we turned it into something that gives you at least a high-level overview. But there's also a resource in the background here, because really what this also is a list of all the investment funding that has been performed by the government of Cameroon in that country, right? And so what's interesting is the degree to which OpenSpending as a platform is involved in these different sites. So this is a site that we at the Open Knowledge Foundation built in cooperation with the World Bank Institute. But on the other hand, this is something that we hardly had a hand in, right? This is something that people mostly did on their own. There was a few emails of kind of support and assistance, but really this is something that people can do by themselves. And that's something that I find really interesting about OpenSpending, is basically the idea of building this reusable infrastructure that can be replicated in a number of places. And so in order to facilitate that, what we basically offer to people is three things. Number one is we offer technologies, stuff like data marts or data warehouses that nobody who's in their right mind would ever want to be confronted with. We're trying to basically give people that technology in a way that's suitable for financial data. The second thing we're trying to give people is materials, as guidance on how to use this. So given that I am in a country that hasn't had any kind of financial transparency yet, how would I approach this? Where do I find some data? Which data is interesting? Which data is more boring? How do we clean up data? How do we then do interesting stuff with it? And that I think leads into farm subsidy and what kind of stories can be told. Because I mean, there's this fantastic thing that if you have 190 countries and someone in one country finds a fantastic way to tell a story with some financial data, then there's going to be some other countries where you can replicate that same story because the data is available there as well, or similar data is available. And you can then basically just take that recipe and roll it out and see what happens when you analyze, I don't know, this type of expense in your country. So I think that's really exciting as a way of cooperating between different countries. What we're now trying to do is basically to get more people to contribute to this platform, so that when someone builds a new type of visualization or builds a new type of browser or something that's interesting for analysis, and then this also becomes available to other people and to other countries, and they can basically roll it out very easily. And at the same time, what's happening through this kind of centralized platform is that we're building a kind of centralized store of a lot of information. So on the one hand, we're collecting this high-level budgetary information, which is only useful if you're leading a very high-level debate where you have differences about kind of policy priorities and stuff like that. On the other hand, we're also collecting very granular, very detailed information. So if you go onto the OpenSpending and you just, come on. I'm German, so I have to use one of our own. So I hope this works now. But basically what this will give you is a search of the company Siemens across different data sets. So you might have some contracts that Siemens has done with the German government because I've uploaded some data from Germany. You might have some data that's about, Lucy, why is this not working? You might have some data that's coming from the European Commission because they've been doing funding for through the Siemens, and you might have some stuff that comes from the UK government because they're really big on opening up this information, right? And I think that's really interesting to kind of create this pool where everything flows into, because people need it for their own purposes to be in there, but then you also get the benefit of having the ability to search across different data sets and investigate that. Still, I'm kind of worried about this stuff because we have a lot of fantastic resources in here and it's hardly being used by journalists. I don't know, I think there's a number of reasons why this is happening. Number one, I think, is that it's not visible enough to journalists. So we're kind of nerds, I mean, most of us. And so what we do is we're really happy when we've produced a CSV file. And when we then manage to put some kind of interface on top of our CSV file that gives you a nice visualization, then we're even happier. But we don't have this need to kind of shout it out to the world that much. So often we end up with a CSV file, and I could give you a dozen CSV files that are really interesting for reporters, but that never get visibility with reporters. So I think that's a problem we have to tackle. The second one is what's in there. I think a lot of the data that we have has really, really good stories in there, but you need to have some technical understanding to be able to tell, A, what questions can we answer with it? And you also need to have some kind of self-confidence about the fact that nobody else has asked these questions of that data yet. So I think there's a kind of misassumption, which is that if something is on the web already, then there's no stories in it anymore. And that's not true, because most of the stuff that goes into the web, no human has ever looked at it yet, right? Nobody has tried to understand it yet. And so basically the resources that we are kind of creating are, in a way, they're treasure troves, but people feel that they've already been looted because they stand out in the open. And I think, no, there's still treasures inside there, even though they're standing out in the open. It's just that nobody's opened the box. And the final one is basically about how do we use it then, and how can journalists really make sense of this? And I think this is something interesting that we should discuss in this panel is how do we really make these cooperations between technical and non-technical work, and especially how can we do this across different countries? Because if you look at this on an international scale, there may be someone in Poland who's really good at getting data out of a PDF file, and there may be someone in Spain who's really good at analyzing it because they have a lot of stats knowledge and they understand statistics really well. And then you have someone on the ground in another country, let's say Germany, but they don't know how to do either of these other things. And so I think that's why we need to think more about kind of building these types of communities where you have technical people making their knowledge available internationally to people who work on the ground and who work on a level where it's useful to tell stories. Anyway, that's a quick intro to open spending.
Shall I continue? Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to the organisers for bringing us all here together in such a lovely place to talk about interesting things. I have co-founded a project which attempts, well, it's not the main reason why the project exists, but it has brought together these two communities that Friedrich's talked about in a pretty harmonious working relationship going back to 2004, which makes farm subsidy one of the oldest online data journalism projects, at least in the EU, I think. But the seed of the idea goes back another 5 years before that, to 1999, when and I'm not a journalist or a civic hacker especially, I was working as a political aide to the agriculture minister in Britain. And he was arguing for reform of the common agricultural policy, the policy that pays farmers and other land managers money. And I happened to look over his shoulder at a list that his civil servants had produced of the biggest recipients of farm subsidies in Britain. And it was quite a surprising list. It featured the Queen, a number of members of the nobility, some large companies, the cooperative, which is a big organisation company. I don't know what it is actually, but anyway, it was not the small farmers that you typically associate with the Common Agricultural Policy. And I thought that this information, were it to be made publicly available, would help us make the case for the reforms that we were arguing for. The civil servants said, no, you can't put that information out. It would be a breach of commercial confidentiality. And there the matter pretty much ended until I left working in the government and the new Freedom of Information Act in the UK came into being in January the 2nd, 2005. And I made sure that, working with some colleagues of James at The Guardian, that a joint request that we made for this information about where the money goes was the first thing that would appear on the government's mailbag on that day. And eventually, to cut a long, tortuous story short, we won and got the information. A similar process was going on in Denmark with some Danish journalists who also won in Denmark and got the information out. And we thought, well, let's put our heads together and try and pool resources, pool expertise, and see if there are other countries where there are people who want to do the work that we've been doing. And so that was where farm subsidy came from. And there was a certain serendipity that I knew some people who worked with Up My Street, which was a very early civic hacking. Well, I don't know if it's civic hacking, but it's an early civic website where people could find information out about what's going on near them. And they said, you've got to put all this information on the web that you get out, because then everyone can access it. And we thought, well, that sounds like a good idea, let's do it. And then we obviously bought a ticket for 7 or 8 years of technical heartache and trouble as we attempted to put more and more information that we were obtaining through these successful requests into the public domain on the web. We obtained some funding, and I will come back to that a little bit at the end, about how important it is to obtain funding for a project of this scale. But we set about doing the work that we've been doing since then, which is essentially helping journalists and others who want to make access requests, running the website, organising an annual meetup where we extract the data that's been provided by governments, because during this period we managed to convince the powers that be in Brussels that there should be a new law about financial transparency in the EU budget, that all payments should be made public. The payments are made public in quite difficult to access ways, which essentially means that every year we had to have a sort of festival of screen scraping, which we called the Data Harvest Festival, even though it took place in April, which is no time for a harvest. But we thought it would be a nice way of describing the thing. And out of that has come some good stories, some big stories relating to inequalities in the distribution of funds, some stories relating to corruption and conflict of interest. I can't go through them all in the time that are available. Some silly stories relating to bizarre recipients, prisons, railway companies, water companies, pony clubs, golf clubs. All of these were cropping up in our website, and the classic, very basic level of cross-border collaboration is for the Swedish journalists to say, hey, we found some pony clubs in Sweden, and then the Bulgarian participant in our meeting searches the Bulgarian data for pony clubs in Bulgarian and finds some as well, or not. So that, basic things like that. We found some dead recipients, and this was by matching the data against the Swedish tax records, which have the date of birth of people. We found some recipients who died several years ago, who were still getting farm subsidies. We found very large recipients, big sugar companies, big multinationals, Campina, Nestle, getting huge sums of money from the Common Agricultural Policy. And some of this has driven some change in the policy, I would say, and that's been an interesting thing for me, because ultimately I probably am an activist more than anything, and I'm interested in the world being a better place and the delivery of policy more closely resembling what the politicians say it's going to do. So there is now a proposal that only active farmers will receive farm subsidies. That's yet to be defined, but that's interesting, and presumably that will rule out dead farmers from receiving subsidies, which would be a good thing. It's also resulted in the introduction of a cap on the total amount that you can receive, which I think is around about 300,000 euros. So that will affect Her Majesty the Queen and a number of other large landowners who won't get so much money as they used to get in the past. So that's a sort of brief overview. We spawned a sister project, fishsubsidy.org, which does a similar kind of thing, looking at the fisheries subsidies, and has found a number of similarly bizarre and interesting stories relating to curious delivery of the policy in that area. And that's a website that you can take a look at. And that's got some actually very interesting Italian stuff relating to drift nets, which is a big issue, and EU funding of drift net removal, and the same fishermen being paid multiple times for handing in the same drift nets, which is a bit of a curious situation down there in southern Italy. It's been a huge challenge, and sometimes it's useful to ask yourself some counterfactual questions. What would have happened if we hadn't have spent all this time building a website? What if we just put CSV files onto the web? And probably most of our journalistic outcomes would have been more or less the same without the website. Because actually, the people who are working with the data are working with data offline, usually because it's a bit faster. It's quite easy to set a small number of people up with a database on their computer so that they can work with. However, putting the website up there, I think, convinced European politicians and bureaucrats that transparency in financial transactions was a good thing, and without that they wouldn't have passed the new law that introduced financial transparency. On the other hand, if we hadn't put our website up there, it's possible that the two German farmers who brought a case to the European Court of Justice objecting to the fact that their names were now made public with the amount of information, with the amount of money that they'd received from the Common Agricultural Policy, they might not have brought that case if all the information had just stayed in the hands of a few journalists or activists. And they won that case a few years ago, which meant that suddenly the transparency system was struck down by the Court of Justice. Only companies would be included in it, and this really created a big problem for our work. So I'm not convinced on platforms necessarily as a journalistic tool, but I think they're quite good for PR, and that's not to be sniffed at. Then funding, the last thing I want to talk about. We were quite generously funded by an American foundation called the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and they had an interest in reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. And my job was to kind of manage that uneasy relationship with a bunch of journalists who want to be journalists and want to be independent and have their own, agendas, and not be dictated to by any foundation. And yet I had to explain to the foundation what we were doing, and having this journalistic community looking at the data and making it available was going to yield benefits for what they were interested in. And that was quite a difficult relationship it was quite a difficult balancing act in a sense, because journalists don't like to be paid by foundations with agendas, because that colours the nature, that may colour their work, or it may at least give their critics a chance to attack them. But I don't think that any journalistic organisation would have been able to muster the resources necessary to do the work that we did. So ultimately it was essential, particularly in terms of paying for physical meetups, which are quite expensive, just with the people travelling around the place, and then obviously the website, which has been a bit of a money sink. So going forward, that funding stream has ended, and we're in a slightly more dicey situation as far as funds are concerned. Fortunately, the Open Knowledge Foundation has stepped in and has offered to host our website and improve it, I'm sure, on their servers. So that's great. So that means that our project can now focus on the cross-border collaboration, the annual meetup, and that seems to be a reasonably good division of labour. Let the experts in platforms help you with a platform, and you do the things that you're good at as journalists, which is finding stories and meeting each other, because ultimately it's good to meet, I think. And we don't have a mailing list and things like that, but we just have this annual meetup, and people can come in and out of the network. But that's probably all I've got time for. So thanks.
You could mention when it takes place.
Oh, it takes place next week. Sorry. So yeah, book your tickets to Brussels. Come along and join us next week. Or the year after, if you need a little bit more planning. But basically, it takes place around the annual deadline for when member states must publish information on farm subsidy recipients, which is 30th of April. So we just try and have it close to that.
Thank you, Jack. Let's move on to Jane.
Hi everyone, my name is James and I am a journalist, and if that sounds a lot like coming into a support group, it probably should these days. So my job now is I'm data editor at The Guardian, and I think actually in several years of doing this I barely got a single story out without collaborating in some way, so I'm a little bit sort of hooked onto this, whether it was with a network called Help Me Investigate, which was set up by a guy called Paul Bradshaw in the UK, and this was essentially almost a citizen journalism project. People sort of group around different areas of interest and put in as much or as little as they like, and essentially a few sort of professional journalists working in their spare time try and chivvy everyone along, which is always good fun because it's like herding cats. But, you know, we got sort of great things of interest in health, on the Olympics, on even quite strange things like the worst street in Birmingham for getting caught by parking ticket wardens. And if that isn't news you can use, I don't know what is. But then obviously we've sort of done things even within the UK. We had a big set of riots in 2011, and at The Guardian we had a team headed up by Paul Lewis, who's speaking here later this week. But we worked with the London School of Economics, we worked with the Open Society Foundations, and with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So, you know, we do work with funders. And if we hadn't, we wouldn't have got that sort of 4-month journalism project off. But I think probably the two big collaborations, the really sort of gnarly ones, are WikiLeaks, of which more tomorrow, or what we've just recently done on offshore secrecy. Now, the offshore secrecy project was big. It all sort of came from a guy called Gerard Ryle at the ICIJ, which is another of these sort of journalism foundations, sort of backed by foundation money that can be an independent, not-for-profit outlet. And America is great at this, and the rest of us should have more of them. More, please. And Gerard got hold of a massive trove, 200 gigabytes of offshore data. But good gosh, is it complicated. It is. You know, we sort of like to think people hear big data cache and you feel like you type in a name and get this big, brilliant sort of thing that will just come up immediately with all of their secrets. This is a look at the BVI, which is a really big offshore haven, which frankly full of some very bad people. And this is a small snapshot of one aspect of some BVI companies. And these offshore things are very long chains in both directions. And so you get one extra glimpse. So it's like trying to make a jigsaw with only about 5 of the pieces and never having seen the lid. And so Gerard quite sensibly realised he couldn't do that himself, and frankly, nor could anyone else. And this is why it's kind of lucky that collaboration is good, because there ain't going to be any escaping it. No one could have built the resources to have looked at this themselves. The money just isn't there anymore. And really no one would have the expertise, because there were stories relating to Britain, to Canada, to Eastern Europe, to Russia, heck of a lot to Russia, to China, to America. And no one has that much expertise either. And so the ICIJ is a journalism network. It has members in lots of different organisations and in lots of different countries. And Gerard essentially reached out and asked different people if they wanted to be involved and work on it. Now, that came from a leak, but all sorts of things. You are going to have to collaborate if you want to do big investigations now, and you're going to have to do it cross borders for the money, for the fact that now we kick up a lot more data, a lot more information. There's a bigger volume of stuff. And also that most targets and most issues work cross borders now. I mean, even if you're trying to investigate one company mainly based in your country, you're going to find, if it's of any size, it will be operating in at least a dozen more, and might have corporate entities in a dozen more than that. So you might have to be doing this. But it is hard, because I don't know, I mean, obviously no one in this room, but some journalists have sort of quite particular ways of working, and maybe even what some people would describe as egos. So, you know, don't want to be too contentious. But, you know, it's like herding cats, but sort of angry 40-year-old cats with lots of university educations and their own bosses who all want to do different things. And this isn't the best analogy I've ever started, but this is tricky. And so I think, especially off the offshore one, which, you know, WikiLeaks actually was an incredibly successful journalistic partnership in many ways. It's just unfortunately we all fell out. And so it's not a nice, inspiring example. Whereas I think the offshore secrecy thing, given how complex it was, there were about 40 news organisations across the globe. I don't really remember any of the rows, which means they weren't that bad. Trust me, I'm quite petty, I remember these things. And I think there's actually some rules to make this work that are quite counterintuitive and might go against some of the instincts. But when you are doing the journalism bit, especially if you're looking at big bits of data, there's this big temptation to try and build yourself into a sort of pan-national team. And hey, let's all work off the same platform. Let's get an online search thing that works in the same way for all of us. And let's try and look at things in a fairly systematic way. That seems sensible. You know, let's maybe have a weekly email or a, you know, twice weekly conference call to share what we've found. And good gosh, before long, you're spending 6 months setting up all the systems to start work. And everyone will disagree on the way that you're approaching. And it just quagmires very quickly. And the key thing is, why are you pulling in different teams and different experts and, frankly, you know, data rock stars, if not to let them do their thing? The whole point of collaboration is to get different teams with different approaches looking at stuff. So let them. You know, I think the key thing is minimal ground rules. Work out what you are and aren't doing. So when are we not going to publish until? Are we going to try at the end of this to have a platform, a public interface, or a private interface? And when are we going to start building that? Because until then, why don't we all try and look at it in our own ways? So try and set out a really minimal set of ground rules, and the fewer you have, the easier they are to agree and the more sacrosanct they are. And remember, anytime you want to change them, you're then going to have to get everyone to agree to it, which is never that much fun. Now, sharing is good. The key things, especially with things like offshore, that were good to share were when we made breakthroughs on things like the structure of the data. One of the downsides of this was part of it was taken from a whole ream of a really complex set of linked databases. And we had each table and each field, but none of the documentation and none of the links between the fields. And so we essentially were trying to work out how these 50 different complicated data tables linked up. And so when people made breakthroughs on that, that's nice to share. But what we didn't do all the time was go, oh, hey, we've just found this great new guy. We think we've got a really good story on this Brit who did this, and then in 2004 he did this and moved through. We shared top lines late on at the end. We didn't spend too much time constantly sort of sharing news lines because we were all interested in different ones. And it's actually a great way to stop people pursuing their own avenue, which might, if they keep doing it, get a much bigger story than you're doing, to get them looking at yours as well. So if you want a plurality of stories and a plurality of angles, don't constantly bug each other with what you found. You know, this is, bear in mind, this is the rules for a really big, sprawling one, like WikiLeaks or like Offshore Secrets. If you're working on a much tighter project, maybe you've got to talk a bit more. So yeah, I think the key thing is sort of working out what's at the core, what is the bits that you really have to share, what's the thing that if you think, gosh, if someone found out in 6 months that I knew this, they're going to be livid. Share that. If it's just a good angle, a good story, don't share that. And I think beyond that, it's just nice to sort of deep breath, bit of give and take. Occasionally things won't quite go your way. Save your fights for when it matters to you, and then you're not the person who's constantly kicking off and saying no. You know, on the stuff that you don't like but doesn't cause you massive grief, deep breath, suck it up, take it. And then when you go, no, hang on, this would really cause me some problems because this, and this, it's not, oh, gosh, he's kicking off again. It's, okay, he's usually fine with stuff, he must mean it. So it's quite nice to try and be a little bit placid, not too placid. And so, yes, I think that's sort of the core things. It's resist the temptation, ultimately, beyond everything else, of trying to build yourself into a cohesive team. There's a reason you've got loads of different people looking at something. There's a reason for that kind of stuff. Work together, enjoy doing it, keep in touch, all of that, but don't try and make yourself one newsroom and one unit, because it's almost a wisdom of crowds situation. You'll get a much better answer with little teams independently, and you might get better searchers and different searchers. And what we found is the way we set up to look at the data worked really well for some stuff, but missed some other bits. And so occasionally we would swap and ask one of the other teams, hey, you know, we're looking at this particular thing. Can you just check, you know, we've got this document, and this document. Can you check you don't have anything else? You know, lots of helping out, but not this cohesive thing. But this is good. Big data is happening, you know. Rather than little leaks, you're going to see big leaks in future because that's how it comes. You know, once that offshore thing would have been a 50-page list of companies. Now it was everything. You can't look at that, so we've got to have collaboration. We can't afford not to because, you know, when I saw Aaron Pilhofer yesterday talking about his team of 18 for this thing and 7 for this and 5 for this, there's basically 3 of us and a dog doing data journalism at The Guardian. It's a tiny team and we're a well-resourced newsroom. For big teams, for big investigations, we've got to have to work together. There's less money around. It works, so make it work.
Thank you, James. Let's move on to Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Radu, and I work with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. I'll just adjust the screen first, and then I'll dive in. I think it was this one. So what we do, obviously, at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project is... Oh, this is not good. Which one is? Oh, this one. Yes. Right here. Okay, so what we do is we investigate complex organized crime structures that operate across borders. We investigate and we go very deep into following the money. Our network is a network that spans from all the way from Russia to Albania, so it covers most of Eastern Europe. We also have some initiatives right now. We work with journalists in Mexico. We also work with journalists in Tunisia. And it's all about mapping and investigating organized crime and high-level corruption. Now, we started as an all-investigative reporters team, but in the past 3 years, we co-opted in our network also artists and hackers, because we had a need for them, and I think they had a need for us. In our case, it's just, as in the cases that were previously described, it's all about cooperating across borders, and it's all about following the money. We're covering an area that is not covered, for instance, by law enforcement. There is no global law enforcement. You have national law enforcement with national interests. But the reality is that organized crime operates across borders, operates at a higher level. They are in a way untouchables because they operate at that level. They're using complex offshore structures. They corrupt officials in most governments of the world. And in order to investigate them, in order to investigate their moves, the money they make, the impact they have, you have to kind of be like them. You have to be very flexible. You have to be able to move across border. You have to share information easily. And it all has to be very, very fast. Because, again, if you look at the law enforcement, you know, whenever they need to cooperate between countries, it's a very, very slow process. I mean, can you imagine, for instance, an organized crime group that operates in Iran and the United States? Would there be cooperation between law enforcement in Iran and law enforcement in the United States? I don't think so. So this is where we come in, investigative reporters that operate across borders and track down organized crime and corruption. But what we realized, you know, in the past few years is that, yes, we did some good stories, they were impactful, we were happy with them, but we realized this was not nearly enough. And this is because I mean, all across the globe, I think there aren't that many investigative reporters, and especially investigative reporters that can follow the money and that can go deep into this type of research. So we realized the need to cooperate with other people, with hackers, visual artists, the society in general, because it's only through these joint efforts that you can investigate high-level organized crime and corruption. And I'll give you one example. This is a story about a gold field somewhere in Azerbaijan. There's a village called Chovdar in Azerbaijan. You probably never heard of this village. Now, there was some exploration there, and people found gold in the vicinity of Chovdar. And there were some mining companies coming there to exploit this gold. And they started the exploitation there. They started building some plants to process the ore and all that. But, you know, the villagers in this village of Chovdar are very angry at these companies. And they say it's all the blame of the Ingilis. The Ingilis is the Azeri word for Englishman. So they're blaming it all on the Englishmen, on these Ingilis, because one of their water supplies in the village was cut. They had 2 water supplies, and one was cut, so they can't access it anymore because it's used by the mining exploitation. Now, the reality is that it is not the Ingilis that are exploiting or trying to exploit the gold there, that are exploring for gold there. It's a consortium of companies. The Azeri state is part of that consortium, and only one of the companies is actually based in the United Kingdom. The company is called Globex International LLP, Limited Liability Partnership. So, but if we look at this company, we'll find out that the company is owned by 3 Panama-based companies, where we'll find, you know, the daughters of the Azeri president. So it's not the Ingilis that started that investment there. It's actually the first family of Azerbaijan. And not only that, but the rights to mine there for this golden ore were signed by exactly the president of the country, Ilham Aliyev, the father of Arzu Aliyeva and Leila Aliyeva. Now, identifying this, it's easy. Once you have the names of the companies, once you get the information from the ground, then you just go to a few databases and you map this, you know, and you find that indeed the family of the president is involved. I mean, it seems easy, but without a network, we would not be able to do something like this. We need someone in Azerbaijan that can read the documents that were signed by Ilham Aliyev. We need at least someone who can search the Azeri Google, you know. We need someone to go to that place and to talk to the villagers so that we don't just have a dry story saying, oh, look, the family of the president of Azerbaijan has a company in an offshore haven. That is not a story. The story is how the people are affected by the fact that the family of the president of Azerbaijan has a company in an offshore haven. And this story is also an example of cooperation with hackers. Now, once you identify a pattern, and we identified here a pattern in the sense that the family of the president is using Panama-based companies, you can assume that there might be other investments aside from the Chovdar gold field, where you have the same family involved secretly. So, now, the problem with Panama is that there is an official register of companies in Panama that is free of charge. You only have to create a login and then you can search for companies there. But you can only search for companies. You cannot search for persons' names, which is a limitation. And this is where our friend and colleague now, Dano Huygin, who's a British hacker, came in. Because he scraped the Panama registry of companies and he created a much simpler interface where you can also search by the name of the person. This is value added on top of data that was already available. Now, if we input here the name Aliyev, you'll find out that there are a few persons that are called Aliyev that have companies in Panama. But 3 of them interest us: Leila Alieva, Arzu Alieva, and Mehriban Alieva. The first 2 are the daughters of the president, and the third is the wife of the president, who is also a member of the parliament, so she's not even supposed to be involved with commercial companies. Now, if we click on Leila Alieva, for instance, we'll find out that there aren't just the 3 companies that we've identified as involved in the goldfield business. There are another 7 companies, so there's 10 companies in all. Now, all these companies have investments back in Azerbaijan. So now again, we take the information from here and we go back to Azerbaijan and back to the reporters there that know how to dig the money locally. And then we find out that, for instance, some of these companies are involved in a telecom company in Azerbaijan. And that telecom company was a new arrival on a market where there were 2 existing companies already. And this new telecom company was given the upper hand, and they were the only ones that were able to have 3G internet, to provide 3G access to internet on their network. Then there's banks where you have these companies involved, and so on. So again, in this case, it's cooperation with hackers that give you access to information, but really what makes the difference is the people on the ground. And again, I want to stress that thing that I said in the beginning, that our capacity is limited. Now, I suppose that things like this occur in many other countries. You know, it would be useful, of course, maybe to run the names of the world's politicians through the Panama database or through the offshore leaks database and so on. But again, this is going to be very hard because our time is limited and our numbers are limited. This is why what we're trying to do at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project is to build tools that could assist others to investigate. And I'll talk about this in my next session. But the idea is that we want as many people as possible engaged in these efforts, because otherwise, I mean, yeah, we'll have a few good stories, but not enough stories to make a difference. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. This was our last presentation for the day, and we'll now move on to the discussion. We've seen 4 examples of amazing projects that address crucial public issues, from public spending, following the money, to organized crime and high corruption. And all the panelists brought up important issues that we should discuss further. Starting from how can journalists and hackers work together, because as we've seen, the cultures are quite different and bring different values and norms into journalism. Jack touched on the important issue of collaboration across borders, and it's not only about infrastructure and meeting and events, but it's also about serendipity. Transparency is also important, but it can also produce challenges and bring your project down, as it happened, unfortunately, in the case of farm subsidies. And of course, funding is a very essential issue. Another thing that we've learned is why are networks important, in case any of you is not convinced yet of why it's important to work in teams and collaborate across borders. And of course, the one obvious issue is the limited capacity of an individual journalist, but it can also help get funding to your project. And of course, these days, most issues transgress borders. So when it comes to corruption, money, the answers won't be found in one country. You have to work across borders. So I would propose to start with going into a bit more depth into how journalists and hackers can work together. Because we've seen also, for those of you who were in the session yesterday, the case of Nate Silver and the controversy that comes from the different approaches that hackers and journalists have to producing stories. As we've seen, the hacker culture places emphasis on transparency and making data available for the public to do their own analysis and take their own decisions. So journalism is a sort of a research tool for audiences, whereas the journalistic culture and the investigative journalism tradition tells us that data is important in as much as it can tell a story. And the role of the journalist is to provide interpretation. So what are your thoughts on this issue?
So I think the first thing is it can be really frustrating from both sides of this, the sort of hackers back and forth. And it's really easy to stereotype. You know, we have this journalism tool where we like to put narrative front and center. We tell stories. We use data for that. We want to get something done on time for the right hook, for the right reasons. And whereas, you know, hackers like to build platforms, they like things to be reusable. Essentially, journalists, we like to write stories. Hackers like to build platforms, and so we've each got the thing we like, and so we say this is the right thing. It's a little bit like, you know, you're sort of faced with trying to do some kind of DIY task, and one guy's got a screwdriver and the other's got a hammer, and you're each saying, hey, this is the right one. Sometimes you need both. And I think part of the issue is actually we've got to stop stereotyping each other, and we all do it, and it is boring. Look, we're generally trying to get the same things out of this. We want more accountability. We want a really great project. We want to draw attention to stuff that really matters. And sometimes we have to kind of acknowledge that neither of our skill sets has got to do that on its own. And sometimes building a platform isn't going to be the right thing. With a lot of data, it's released differently every year, or the thing in it matters differently every year. And you can end up spending a huge amount of money to actually get a platform which never really does what you want it to. And sometimes it's better to be agile. Similarly, a lot of the time, we write the same news story every year. And why not just have a platform and almost something that automatically builds it? You know, for things like hospitality data or information like that, that would totally be doable. But instead, we sort of just have this thing of you're a journalist or you're a developer. You know, it's really great having your data up as a journalist. People give you new angles. People can check you're working, and you're not just saying, hey, trust me, I am a big shot reporter, man. You know, why would you doubt it? You've got your data up, you've got your working up. It's nice, but we really, really do all have to come into it just being that bit more humble than we are. And that is hard.
Paul, would you like to add something?
I think there's a lot of common ground there, and what we're trying to do lately is to kind of mix the platform with the narratives, and this comes to new ways of shaping investigative reporting. So we're talking lately, and we're doing it a little bit, we're doing it to some extent, about layering investigative reporting. Where at first you just have an infographics, just like the infographics I showed you, so that people can look at it, you know, and can grasp what the story is about a bit. But then some people are going to be interested in a bit more than that, so they can go to the second layer where they can find the narrative, where they can find the video, the audio, the whatever. Some other people are going to be even more interested, and that also comes down to transparency, to your transparency as an investigative reporter. And they're going to want to see how you process the data, what kind of data you used. So there you actually put all the data that you have available. And then you have an extra layer where you actually explain how you did the story, and you accompany the story with, for instance, tutorials on how to mine databases, how to do that. So I don't think that the platform excludes the narratives and the other way. I think you can attach the platform to the narratives and the narratives to the platform. So I think that's right now very, very valuable, because what we're doing is, I mean, for our narratives, we're using limited information from a great amount of information. But a lot of that information can make sense to other people. So I think it's very valuable to have it out anyway, even if you don't cover it with your narratives, with your particular narratives, because maybe you have a regional angle or a national angle or whatever. just to layer it in such a way that you raise the interest of the people. Lots of our stories came exactly from this, from sharing this information, from people seeing in the back data, you know, some name that rang a bell to them, you know. I can give you a short example. For instance, when we're training investigative reporters, you know, we went, for instance, to Egypt, in Cairo, and we brought there, you know, we scraped some databases, and we brought there all the Egyptian citizens that have companies in the UK and in Switzerland. Now, of course, to us, those names told nothing, but with investigative reporters in Egypt, they were able to identify their names of people that were connected to the former regime, and so on. So data means different things for different people, and yeah.
Jack, Friedrich, would you want to have a go at this question?
Yeah. I think the fact that people your room is full, people interested in data journalism is if it weren't this room that was going to be full, there'd be some other room somewhere else that was going to be full of journalists who want to work with data. Because if you're in the information business, and that's, I guess, what journalists are in the information business, they're going to need to have these skills ultimately, and I hope that the gap in terms of skill between journalists and hackers is going to narrow, and partly that will be because journalists are learning a new set of things, working with spreadsheets, working with databases, but also because I think there are actually, it's all, in some ways it's becoming easier. There are, for people who aren't comfortable coding, they can use graphical tools for scraping websites. Google Fusion Tables provides a really good way to match data from one data set to another, which is incredibly important in terms of finding stories. You know, one data set will get you a few kind of easy stories, but then when you match it, when you combine it with another one, you get a much richer picture, assuming you've chosen the right one to combine it with. But you know what I mean. And I think it's all becoming, you know, Google Refine is providing quite good, easily accessible tools for non-tech oriented people to clean up their data. So I think we're heading into a kind of convergence to a certain extent. And then I suppose what it comes down to is in terms of skills, and then it comes down to motivation and why you're interested in doing it, whether you're interested to get good stories to sell your newspaper, which is ultimately what journalists' core motivation is going to be, to get to their truth, but to get to the truth in a compelling way that's going to add to the business of their outlets, or hackers who, you know, the stereotype being that they want to make a better world, they want to empower citizens to understand the world around them and to take action and to improve democracy, so that democracy isn't just simply about voting every 4 years. You know, so I think those differences will still exist, but in terms of basics, in terms of the work that you do and the skills that you have, there is going to be some convergence, which I think is really encouraging.
Yeah.
Can we have the hacker perspective on this?
I don't know whether I'm the authoritative hacker source on this. I mean, one thing that I find surprising is how much it comes down to kind of economics, to how much resource you have, right? Because basically, the moment you start adding hackers to a team, you have people who don't write text, which I guess in journalism is kind of a sin. So I think it's no coincidence that most of the organizations who can actually do this are either really big, or they're doing it in some kind of external entity that's not actually funded through advertising or whatever it is that drives the normal business, right? So there's things like ICIJ or kind of big funded organizations, and there's things like what I'm doing right now, which is basically I'm hanging out funded by a foundation in a newsroom for a year to figure out what tech I can help them with. But that's kind of, it doesn't scale very well, right? There's eight of us doing this in the whole world, and there's a lot more newsrooms that could benefit from it. So I think that's the first thing, right? That it's incredibly expensive, and we need to find better ways around that and to kind of allow these teams. The other thing is really kind of, I think, about learning each other's skills a lot. So I think for journalists, it's going to mean that accessing a database has to be as natural as picking up the telephone, because these are both ways of acquiring information. And the fact that now you can probably get a lot more quantitatively, but also increasingly in terms of good stuff from a database that you used to get from the telephone. Just means that in order to be the top information acquirers in society, I think journalists need to learn more of these skills. It's interesting for me as a coder, basically, to also learn about how to engage with journalism, because in a lot of ways they're very, very different processes, right? So, for example, when we train ourselves to be programmers, what we train basically is we train to reduce ambiguity in everything we do, right? A piece of software that has ambiguity in it is shit. But basically what investigative journalism, as far as I understand it, is all about exploring ambiguity and kind of surfacing what's behind that. And so basically, in order to be useful to an investigative journalist as a coder, I have to get worse as a coder, which is horrible, right? I don't know whether I could still write good production software that would run a fridge, right? So these things, I think, on both sides require a lot of adaptation. And yeah, so and the final thing I think about the platforms, I think the amazing thing is we can actually start at some point thinking about which parts of our jobs or of journalist jobs can we start turning into heuristics. And that's quite a mean and threatening thought, I guess, but I think it's also interesting to think about this now. It's basically, once you have a lot of data, right, which kind of routine journalistic questions, which kind of routine investigations you would want to do, can we start turning into automated processes where you as a journalist basically increase your impact by having a set of programs that do some of the more repetitive tasks for you on an automated basis. And then based upon that, you as a human do what you do best, which is kind of synthesis and bringing it together, applying context, asking, is this actually news or is it just noise? But that's maybe something for the future.
Thank you, Friedrich. Another important issue that was mentioned in some of the talks is the issue of funding and sustainability. So how do you get these networks to work once the journalist got the scoop? And I think Jack mentioned already something about how his projects are sustained, but perhaps the other panelists would like to speak more about this aspect related to their projects.
Okay. Yeah, you need a lot of funding to be able to do cross-border investigative reporting. And before I mention the funding, I just want to say that the guy that scraped the Panama database, Dan O'Huigin, works with us, and he's also a journalist. He published his first investigation for us about 3 weeks ago, and it was a very, very good one. So there's all this intersection where hackers become journalists, and journalists become a little bit hackers, and so on and so on. Yeah, but coming back to funding, when we started OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is a coalition of centers for investigative reporting and a group of independent journalists in some countries, we started it without any kind of money. Now, over time, we proved the value of such a network, of this cross-border collaboration, and we started receiving funding. And we're sponsored right now by the Open Society Foundations. We're sponsored by USAID, and we're also sponsored by a Swedish Agency for Development, and I think we have some smaller grants in various countries from other foundations. But in order to operate something like OCCRP, we're operating right now on a budget close to $1 million US a year, which is very big for an organization. Now, for instance, part of that money goes into libel insurance. So we're also taking care of the legal aspect of this. And then, of course, part of the money goes, I mean, most of the money goes for reporting, and some of the money goes for developing tools. But this is something that also kind of stops us in our tracks, because you always have to keep your eyes peeled, you know, to look for new opportunities for funding, to write proposals, to go pitch your ideas to various potential funders, and so on. Right now, I didn't mention Google. Google is sponsoring some of our ideas right now. There's this initiative called the Investigative Dashboard, and we have an agreement, we signed a contract with Google Ideas. This is a part of Google, where they're helping us shape this tool that I will talk a bit more afterwards. So these would be our funders.
So, well, I work for The Guardian, which, as everyone knows, is a commercial powerhouse. So that's mean. You shouldn't laugh. No. I mean, we have the advantages. We're a big news organisation. We're the third biggest news organisation online in the world. We don't make a profit. We very much don't make a profit. And part of what we're working out how to do is to get towards being sustainable, and doing that and still funding journalism is really difficult. And because The Guardian is actually not for profit, it's the while funding good journalism that's taking the priority. And so there's all sorts of things that you can do and that we're doing. You know, as ever, we've made money from advertising. And I mean, the newspaper has always been this brilliant bundle deal. You fund really expensive, courageous journalism with classified adverts, TV reviews, features, and Pamela Stephen Connolly in our case. That's kind of been how it works, and the internet is ripping apart this bundle, and I don't think anyone has really managed to show investigative journalism on its own can sustain its funding. And so you rely on packaging, on funding, on foundations, on all sorts. And actually that's how we're trying to work it. You know, as ever, we have advertisers. Google sponsor little bits of the site, you know, as do all sorts of other people, which has all the same issues that it does with advertisers. And actually taking foundation money, which we do, and it lets us do some great work, and they're really good to work with. But that has all the same issues that working with advertisers does. And in each instance, it's essentially we might love to be in this brilliant ivory tower where we're answerable to no one, and you know, we don't have any foundation funding issues, any advertising issues, any of that. But dream on. And so we'll do, you know, we're looking at business models, we're looking at outside funders, we're looking at everything we can to keep it going. And, you know, I have to say, it's working. I think people are more negative on old media organisations than they should be. You know, I think money-wise, there's a lot more options on the table, and there's a lot more ways to do it than have been looked at. So, yeah, I'm relatively okay. It's all about learning how to do more with less. And luckily, tech and hackers especially, and platforms are all about doing that. So it can work.
I'd like to ask the other panelists to keep their answers short, because we have only 15 minutes and we'd like to take questions from the audience also.
Just on that note, I have a suspicion, or I have a theory which I can't prove, and I need someone to help me prove it, which is that actually data can be part of the solution there, that basically more news organizations are going to turn into mini Bloombergs, where basically the content you produce is kind of advertising for the fact that you have all this information in your house. That basically the reputation you create through reporting is then going to basically validate you as a source of data, and that then you can establish a business model based on the fact that you have good information sources in-house that you can provide other people with access to. So basically you give out the news, and you sell out the sources. No, let's not do that. But yeah, basically you then on a commercial basis allow people access to the underlying data. I think that would be a really interesting model. I don't know whether any non kind of business news organizations are doing this on a grand scale yet.
Does anyone want to respond to that? If not, let's open the floor for questions from the audience. We have 15 minutes, so we can take a few questions. Does anyone have a question? Just raise your hand and tell us your name.
Oh gosh.
Yeah?
Really? Really? With that dull?
Yeah. No. Yeah, just wait for the microphone, please.
Sorry, I'm an old journalist. I come from Brussels. I'm Italian. Maria Laura Franciosi. I've been working for news agencies, and now I'm freelancing. There is a question which has been burning in my head since you started. It's a question of funding. I mean, all of you, either funded by The Guardian or by big research companies, etc. But the value of your research should be paid by the media. I mean, you should be able to sell stories to the media. Do you really think you can make money with this? Because this is the big issue that would attract journalists. Otherwise, it's a wonderful network, it's a wonderful idea to read each other's, but you also have to go outside of the funding, in different ways. I mean, it is really a way to create. We have a problem now with money for journalists. Journalists don't get jobs. And so is this really a way to recreate a new form of journalists to create new jobs? My question.
Thank you for that. Who would like to have a go at this question?
In one sense, these projects might seem like actually new media outlets, and therefore it doesn't really matter whether it's being sold or just amplified by existing media, or eventually becomes its own, its own media platform. I mean, I'm not sure that that's what everyone wants, and it's very good to work with journalists because journalists bring so much to the party in terms of their skills and all that kind of stuff. But I personally don't see any difference between being funded by a foundation and being in a newspaper that's funded by a wealthy proprietor or a Russian oligarch. I mean, look at how the media is going. It's not making money, and therefore it's being bought up by people who want to own media for one reason or another, and are prepared to sink their own personal fortunes made elsewhere into the media business. And actually, what?
That's not new, though.
That's not new. That's Rothermere or whoever. That's the history of media. So I don't think that there's money out there, and you have to convince people to part with it. That's not very helpful, but that's kind of the basic truth.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
If I may just add something. Yeah, I mean, perhaps in the UK it does not make a difference if an oligarch invests in a newspaper. But I must say that here in Italy or in my part of the world, in Eastern Europe, it does make a huge difference. And that is because the coverage is biased afterwards. There are lots of oligarchs, and we have a media mapping project right now, tracking down the media ownership and connections to organized crime and so on, and offshores, that goes all over Eastern Europe. And we see that the coverage is much influenced. I mean, journalists are not independent. So indeed, when it comes to selling your products, you won't be able to sell your articles to such media outlets. And I'm talking TV, radio, whatever. Most of the media in Eastern Europe is owned by oligarchs that use these media enterprises just as attachments to their empires, business empires. So it's basically...
The point I was making was that taking money from a foundation is sometimes preferable, or many times preferable, to taking money from an oligarch who's just bought up a newspaper.
So I'm touched at your faith that no British proprietor would ever use their newspaper to push a business interest. I'm sure none of us could imagine that happening over there. I think just on the key thing of working as a hack, it's that having data skills can get you hired in the few jobs that are there. It's useful, but also it's just a wider problem of freelancing. It's getting harder because freelance budgets get cut even more than everything else gets cut. You can make money freelancing stories from data. You can't, I've never tried doing it, sort of trying to sell platforms or open access, but for several years before I joined The Guardian, I sold stories to The Telegraph, to The Times, to the News of the World, all based just off data or scraping or quick analysis. You can do it, it's just the economics of it are just as horrible as selling any other news story. You get a front page article that you've worked all week for, you get £200-300. You're not going to make a living that way, but that's because you're not going to make a living as a freelance journalist. It's about the one thing I could ever manage to sell in because they couldn't do it in-house back then. So it helped me freelance, but it wasn't a good income, I have to be honest.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add something on the funding things. We were 2 weeks ago a group of investigative reporting centers, including IRPI, the Italian investigative reporting centers, organized a meeting in the European Parliament because we want the EU to put money into investigative reporting, and we want them to put big money so that independent organizations can survive. It was, I think, a good meeting, and we're hoping that things are going to move along. This same thing was tried a few years back, and it failed. So we hope that right now people realize that investigative reporting is work.
Why it failed?
Yeah, if you want.
No, do you?
Well, it failed because the EU wanted to control this money. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one last quick question, if there is one.
My name's Steve Buttry, and I've often thought your point, Friedrich, about the economic value of data, and I think data analysis beyond the journalism, beyond the stories that it produces. Are there customers for that? Is something that we haven't explored fully enough. And so I'd be interested either in hearing you specifically elaborate more on that, or some of the others respond to some of the possibilities. What types of data might have economic value? Who would the customers be, and how would they pay for it, and so on. Dan Conover's done some interesting writing on that too, and I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
So one example I could name is, for example, we did some work on the UK's expenditure data, right? So the way it gets released is that there are a number of government departments, I think about 500, and every one of them has to put out an Excel spreadsheet every month that contains the lists of all the purchases they made. And there's no central place where this data gets collected. So basically we built one, and we have the service now that every night spits out a consolidated view of what the UK government spent money on. And the prime customer for that, for example, would be the UK government. Because they don't know often what they're buying, who's bought, which kind of thing. A nice example, for example, is software licenses, where basically one government department buys a software license that would cover the whole of the government for 100,000 euros, let's say. And then the next government department doesn't know about that deal, and they buy the same software license for the same amount. And it's a great business model for the software vendors, but it's a bad way to run government. So actually, this would be an interesting way for governments to investigate that. So yes, I think that would be one example where there's data that you can sell. I think also fantastic areas around due diligence, when as a company you're trying to do deals with other companies, and you have responsibilities to check what their involvement in various kind of affairs are. I think that's something where you can build fantastic business offerings around based on investigative work. But maybe others have better examples.
I mean, we've sold data, and we've sold. Well, no, we haven't sold data. We've sold analysis of data, generally to NGO campaigning groups who are interested in farm subsidies, don't have the skills in-house and want us to do something for them, and so we do a bespoke analysis. An interesting story is that when you're campaigning for freedom of information in farm subsidies, one of your biggest opponents is the farmer unions, whose members don't want the amount of money that they get from the government to be made public for obvious reasons of their own interests. So I was often arguing against the president of the National Farmers Union, who was saying this information is not necessary, statistics is fine, you don't need the individual payment information. And so it was very surprising for me one day to receive a phone call from the National Farmers Union membership department asking for our database so that they could mail out all the farmers in the UK and offer them membership of the National Farmers Union, because that's obviously our database, as well as containing the payments information, contains the addresses information. And so I said, sure, but we'll give this to you in a format that you can use if your president comes out in favour of transparency in farm subsidies. And then basically that conversation ended, and we never got in. I mean, we actually have an open data policy, so they could have downloaded the data from our website, but it would have come in a large file that would have probably been very difficult for them to manage, so it never went any further. But there are obvious, and when companies have come to us wanting to do direct mailing of brochures and things like that to farmers, we've generally tried to find a way of saying no to them, because we just think that junk mail is a bad thing generally, and we don't want to encourage it. So that's an arbitrary decision. I guess if they'd offered us lots of money, we might have gone for it. I don't know.
Just a very, very short answer.
We're also approached a lot, by oligarchs and by companies and by lawyers, that want our data, and they're willing to pay big money. A few days ago there was a Russian oligarch asking us for some recordings that we mentioned in one of our articles, and so there is potential there to make money out of this, but that would be a huge conflict of interest. So we just don't go there.
I think we approached the end of our time, so we have to end this session here. I'd like to thank you for joining us. Our next session is at 2 p.m. in Hotel Sangalo, where we'll be teaching how to use the Twitter API to do social network analysis. And I'd like to ask you to join me in giving a big thank you to our panelists